Now we're going to be looking this evening at Daniel and chapter number 5. It's a bit of a lengthy chapter, but we're going to take time to read the chapter through this evening. So Daniel and chapter number 5. We read there these words. It says, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing, and show me the interpretation thereof, shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be third ruler in the kingdom. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live for ever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. For as much as in excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hard sentences, and dissolving of doubts, were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Then was Daniel brought in before the king. The king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men, astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now, if thou canst read the writing, and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy reward to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O thou king, the most high God, gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom, and majesty, and glory, and honour. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was disposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knowest all this, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Then was part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing, Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom, and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances, and art found wanting. Perez, the kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. We just trust that God will bless the time we spent reading His Word and the time that we spent thinking on it this evening. Just to set the scene, I know you've been going through, or I believe you've been going through the book of Daniel, and so you'll have seen the preceding chapters, but just to set the scene, Daniel is one of the children of Israel, but he spent the vast majority of his life living in Babylon. He was born in Judah, but as a young man he was captured, he was effectively kidnapped by Nebuchadnezzar and taken back to Babylon. He was identified by the Babylonian authorities as being very bright, being very intelligent, and so they take Daniel and they take others and they seek to educate them to as high a level as possible. You see, these days, if you want to know something, if there's something you don't know and you want to find out about it, these days you ask Google. But back then, believe it or not, there was a day when Google didn't exist, and back then there was no Google. And so the king amassed intelligent, well-educated advisors and wise men who he would turn to for answers when there were things that he wanted to know. Now, by the time we come to chapter number 5, Nebuchadnezzar is no longer around, and instead we come to Belshazzar, who we've read of tonight, one of the successors to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, how did it get from Belshazzar to Nebuchadnezzar? Secular historians tell us that Nebuchadnezzar died after a fairly spectacular reign of 43 years. And after Nebuchadnezzar, his son, a man called Evil-Merodach, you read about him in 2 Kings 25 and in Jeremiah 52, he took over and he reigned. He reigned only for 2 years. Before being assassinated by his brother-in-law, a man called Nero-Glasser. Now, Nero-Glasser, he took the throne and reigned for 4 years before he died a natural death. After Nero-Glasser, his son took the throne, and he was a king who for reasons best known to his parents, had been given a totally unpronounceable name. He was an only child. And he was apparently of limited or diminished mental capacity. He had some form of what we would call these days special or additional needs. He only ruled for a period of 9 months before he was beaten to death by a gang of conspirators who sought to take the throne from him. And indeed, one of those conspirators did take the throne. A man who had some royal blood in him, a man called Nabonidus, took the throne and he became king. And Nabonidus, he ruled until the end of the Babylonian Empire, and until the man we saw mentioned at the end of chapter number 5, Cyrus the Persian, defeated the Empire of Babylon and brought in the Medo-Persian Empire. And you might look at all that or listen to all of that and you might think to yourself, hang on a minute. In that list that we just had, we had Nebuchadnezzar, Evil-Merodach, Nero-Glasser, King Unpronounceable, and then Nabonidus, and then Cyrus. You never mention a guy called Belshazzar, and that's the king that we've just read about in Daniel chapter number 5. So what's going on there? If he doesn't get mentioned in the history as has been sort of discovered by historians and archaeologists and so on. And for a long time, historians and archaeologists, they pointed at that fact, and they said, we have got evidence that Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon. And not, as the Bible says, a man called Belshazzar. And people would take that and they would therefore point to the Bible and say, look, it's inaccurate, and you can't trust it. And they would say big chunks of it are made up. But then the archaeologists discovered a load of other ancient writings that did indeed tell of this man Belshazzar. And he is the son of Nabonidus, and he effectively co-reigned with his father. Belshazzar here in Babylon, as we've read about in this evening, whilst his father was out in the empire leading the armed forces, and so on. And the historians, the archaeologists, they had to admit, oh, okay, so the Bible might actually be correct after all. Now, we don't need the archaeologists and we don't need the historians. to confirm the Bible, and we know that the Bible is absolutely correct, is utterly inerrant, is completely perfect. Anytime the Bible and archaeology disagree with each other, it's just because they haven't dug the stuff up yet and the archaeologists haven't found it, because the Bible is right. The Bible is right. But I do kind of like it when they say, oh, the Bible's wrong, the Bible's wrong, the Bible's wrong, and then they find something out and they have to quietly admit, oh, okay, well, actually the Bible possibly might have got it right in that situation all along. You know, that's what the greatest, possibly the greatest lie of our age, the theory of evolution says that the Bible's wrong. But the day will come, either in time or in eternity, when all those who propagate its deception, all those who believe its lie, will have to admit that actually the Bible was right all along. And so when folks come along and they seek to say, look, this proves that the Bible is wrong, we can say, no, it doesn't. It just proves that you don't understand your field, your area of supposed expertise sufficiently well as yet. Anyway, that's where we're up to in the history of Daniel when we come to Daniel chapter number 5. Now, as we look at this chapter this evening, we are largely just going to proceed through the events and the account of the events and the narrative as it goes. But it might be helpful just to break it up into a few main sections. And a little while I was thinking on this, and just a very simple breakdown came to mind, and that is as follows. So we're going to see, first of all, in verses 1 to 4, we're going to see the folly of the king. The folly of the king as King Belshazzar acts in a very irresponsible and unrighteous way. Then we're going to see the forecast of God in verses 5 to 6 as God speaks and says what is going to happen. We see the failure of the wise men as they're brought in order to read the writing on the wall, and they're incapable of doing so. We're going to see the faithfulness of Daniel as he is then sent for, and he comes in and is indeed able to read the writing and faithfully does so, and honestly gives Belshazzar the meaning of the writing. And then in the very closing verses of the chapter, we'll see the fulfillment of prophecy in verses 30 and 31. So just a simple breakdown for how we're going to look at things this evening. So firstly, in verses 1 to 4, we're going to see the folly of the king. The folly of the king. Now, by this point in history, Belshazzar's father is at the very least away trying to battle the Medes and Persians. I keep getting that wrong. And very probably, in fact, history suggests that by this evening, by the evening that these events are happening, he has in fact been captured and is a prisoner in his enemy's hands. By the time that we get to the evening that we're reading of, the city is apparently surrounded by enemy forces looking to find ways to conquer this extremely well defended city of Babylon. Maybe even as we're reading about this banquet that Belshazzar holds, maybe even as we're reading about it, at that moment, the enemy forces are pouring under the walls of the city. What they did is they diverted the river Euphrates that ran under the city walls and through the city and back out the other side. They diverted it upstream so that the flow of the water went in a different direction, and then they were able to run along the riverbed under the walls where the river used to be. And maybe they are pouring under the walls just at the moment that we are reading of this evening. And what is Belshazzar doing? What's his activity at the time? Belshazzar is, at this time, he's throwing a party. We read in verse number 1, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. You know, Belshazzar there just struck me really as such a picture of the world today. The world is running headlong along that broad road that leads to destruction. There are the greatest issues of time and life and God and eternity that so urgently need addressing. But what are they doing? They're looking for a party. They're pursuing a mindless good time. They're seeking one entertainment after another. They're consumed by pointless and inane social media, and they're glued to trashy reality TV. And they're just like Belshazzar. Just think about the last 18 months. You know, the world has been through a turmoil, the like of which I have never seen. I don't think probably anybody really, or very few folks alive have ever seen as coronavirus has spread across the planet and millions have died. And yet what's the key concern? What's the headlines on the papers just in the last few days before I recorded this? The key concern is is when am I going to be able to go and have a drink inside the pub again? When am I going to be able to have a whole load of folks around my house again? When am I going to... That's the key concern. There are the great issues of life and God and eternity and so on to address. But just like Belshazzar, people are just consumed with pursuing a mindless good time. And that is what Belshazzar is doing here this evening. Here he is. You know something? We as believers are not in the same position as Belshazzar. Belshazzar was facing the judgment of God. But you know something? Whilst we are not in the same position as Belshazzar, that's not to say that we are not capable of doing extremely foolish things with our time, as Belshazzar was doing on this particular evening, of distracting ourselves with the empty and the pointless and the meaningless, and the wood and the hay and the stubble, instead of mining the gold and the silver and the precious stones. You know, a little bit like the city of Babylon, we have the lost world all around us. There is without doubt trouble on every hand. There's a nation that's moving further and further and further away from God, and perhaps we need to ask ourselves, what are we seeking to do about it? Hopefully we are not like Belshazzar, just seeking partying to excess, or just seeking to distract ourselves and please ourselves. But are we unlike him, seeking to address the issues at hand, presenting the truths of God to those that we know and those that we meet, praying for our nation and seeking God's blessing and restoration and revival, exercising our gift to its fullest and to the fullest of our God-given ability? You know, we would do well on occasions from time to time just to review how it is that we spend our time, what it is that we give our time and attention to. As the expression goes, only one life. It'll soon be past. Only what's done for God will last. Well, what was it we read about Belshazzar? Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords. You know, it reminds me of Nero as he plays the fiddle while Rome burns. Here he is. Here's Belshazzar. He knows the Medo-Persian forces are surrounding the city, and yet he busies himself with this banquet, this feast, this party. At the very least, it's stupidity. But I kind of feel, actually, in fact, it's an incredible arrogance. Was this his way of saying, yeah, I know they're outside the city wall, but I'm not worried. I'm not bothered. They might well be besieging the city, but this is Babylon. We are perfectly safe. We don't need to ration our resources. And to prove that point, we're going to do exactly the opposite, and we're going to eat and drink to excess. You know, it's incredible arrogance as he looks at the circumstances and does the exact opposite of what would be wise and sensible. Again, that's the attitude that we see in the world today, isn't it? The Bible says God, and God has a standard. God has a standard. It's set out in the Bible. The Bible says there are absolute rights and absolute wrongs. But the world declares, you know, we're not worried about that. We're not bothered at all. We're going to live by our standard. What we say is okay, or what we say is right, is the standard that we want to live by. Never mind that it completely contradicts what God says, because we don't believe that there is a God to take into account. We know better. That's the attitude of the world today. And it demonstrates an incredible arrogance. And so Belshazzar, having set aside what is right, we see he very quickly descends further and further and further away from what is wise and what is appropriate and what is correct. Verse 1, we've seen already his foolish, his arrogant mentality in holding the event in itself, given the circumstances of the nation. But then at the end of verse number 1 and at the end of verse number 2, we see his error. It goes further and deeper. And he moves from a wrong mentality, he moves to immorality. We saw in verse number 1, he drank wine before the thousands. Verse number 2, the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines. This is not just a fancy meal. This is a scene of excessive excess, of no restraint, of immorality, and of sin. But then his error goes further and deeper still. Having started with a wrong mentality and moved on to immorality, now he descends into idolatry. Verse number 4 tells us this, and he praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. But he's still not done there. He finally goes from a wrong mentality to immorality to idolatry to finally mocking deity. Verse number 3 said, then they bought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and they drank in them. You know, saying as well as mocking God in that act, I feel also there was again an element of arrogance and of boasting there in the use of the temple vessels. What's he saying when he uses those temple vessels? He's saying, you know, saying we're going to conquer this army outside the wall here, just like we've conquered armies in the past. Here are our trophies from victories in the past, and we're going to be victorious this time as well. And so we see just something of his arrogance there again. And so he descends further and further and deeper into sin, and one thing leads to another. You know something, that is so often kind of a principle in life. We see that just in the world today. We see that one thing leads to another, and that sin tends to get deeper and deeper and deeper. Things that in my lifetime, when I was younger, were generally accepted as being wrong, now are generally accepted. And people have descended further and further and deeper into sin. Again, that's a warning for us. You know, I read something a little while ago about an Australian judge, a man called Marcus Einfield. He was caught on a speed camera in his car doing just 6 miles an hour over the speed limit, just 6 miles an hour. He was issued with a fine of £40, whatever that is in Australian dollars, but roughly £40 in our money. But instead of paying the fine and moving on, he decided to write back to the I guess the police force issuing the fine, saying that it wasn't him driving the car. Instead, he said it was an American friend who'd been over for a little while who had borrowed the car. And the courts accepted that, and the ticket was dismissed. However, a newspaper thought they would just check the facts, since this was a judge and somebody in a high position. And they found out, unfortunately for the judge, and I guess unfortunately for the lady involved as well, that the judge's American friend, this lady who had said had been driving the car, had actually died 3 years before the driving offence took place. And in an attempt to escape his lie, the judge told more and more lies, and then he got others to lie on his behalf. Eventually, he would lose his job, he lost his reputation, and ultimately he lost his liberty as he was in prison for 2 years for perjury. One thing led to another. That is so often the case with sin, and as believers we are not immune from that danger, not at all. To think so would in itself be an arrogant thing for us to do, and therefore might we take the warning from the account here of Belshazzar as he descends deeper and deeper and deeper into sin. Anyway, moving on. So we've seen the folly of the king. Now let's see the forecast of God. We read there in verses 5 and 6, in the same hour came forth the fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the walls of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against the other. God intervenes. He causes the fingers of a man's hand to appear floating by the wall, and the hand writes a message there for all to see. It's on the plastered wall, it's over by the candlestick, it's well illuminated, the wall there is nice and smooth, there's no missing it and there's no ignoring it. You know, the thing that struck me here really was Belshazzar's reaction. Do you see how close to breaking point he is? How fragile he is. You know, the writing appears, and in a moment of time, he switches from partying to petrified. If you had asked him 30 seconds before the writing appeared, how are you feeling? How are you doing? He would have said, oh, great, brilliant, having a fantastic time. Everything was fine, everything was fun, and all was good. Truth be told, he was 30 seconds away from being a broken man. He again is like the world today. People put so much effort into presenting a happy, having a great time face. Their Facebook or their Instagram is this carefully crafted reel of edited highlights, seeking to say, everything's great, everything's fantastic, everything's wonderful. Actually though, if folks were willing to be honest, they'd have to say, truth be told, I'm scared. And I'm massively insecure. And it's all a front, and it's something that I put on, and this constantly seeking the next good time and the next experience and so on and so forth. It's just to blot out the scared and the fear and the sadness and the void. The void essentially of no relationship with their maker, the God of heaven and earth. And so in a moment of time, Belshazzar is stripped of all pretense, and he is desperate for answers, as God writes upon the wall. Because he's desperate for answers, he sends for his wise men. We see that next. So in verses 7 and 8 and 9, we see the failure of the wise men. We read there these words: "The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet, have a chain of gold about his neck, and be third ruler in the kingdom." Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. The brightest and best that the world had to offer offered no solution to the problem that Belshazzar had. Belshazzar offered payment and power and prestige and promotion, but still there was no solution. Do you notice, by the way, he offered third in the kingdom? About halfway down, do you see it there? He offers third in the kingdom. Why didn't he offer second in the kingdom? Well, because he was second in the kingdom. Do you remember? He was ruling alongside his father Nabonidus at the time. And so that whole thing, that whole question that historians used to have, the answer really was there in scripture anyway. And that's why he offered third in the kingdom. But anyway, despite all that is offered, the wise men, they fail in their efforts to read the writing upon the wall. And so Belshazzar has to turn elsewhere. And so we move on to maybe our main section this evening, and we see the faithfulness of Daniel in verse 10 to 29. Before we get to Daniel, though, we're introduced to another character in the person of the queen. We read just at the start of this section, it says, "Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed." And then she starts and she says, "There is a man in thy kingdom." And she goes on to give a brilliant description of the character and of the capability of Daniel. Before saying at the end of verse number 12, "Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation." The lady here spoken of as the queen, she would appear to be the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, the mother of Belshazzar. Now this is somebody of a different character. Notice the wisdom that she brings. Notice also that she wasn't at the party. She had to come into the banquet house. There are lessons for us here. You know, this lady stands out. Do we stand out in our culture as somebody of a different character? Can we be relied on to bring a wise, God-centered answer to situations and problems that folks might have around us? Do we take care to absent ourselves from association with the sinful activities of the world? The queen here did, and we ought to also. Anyway, on the face of it, Belshazzar doesn't seem to know about or to know of Daniel until his mother, the queen, mentions him. Now, I just have a question in my mind. I don't really have any proof for it either way, but I have a question in my mind. Is that really the case, that Belshazzar didn't know about Daniel or who he was? I suspect that Belshazzar knew a great deal about Daniel. In fact, I suspect he knew it all. He knew exactly who Daniel was. He knew exactly who Daniel stood for and spoke for. He knew exactly what Daniel believed. And I suspect Daniel was the very last person he wanted to have to call upon at that time. The last person he wanted to bring into the room where, still scattered all around the tables, still dripping with the wine that had been carelessly poured into them, were all the vessels from the temple. And so when Daniel comes in, he has the audacity to say, "Art thou that Daniel?" It's like he's trying to muddy the waters a little bit. I don't really know you. I don't really know about the God that you represent. Oh, these vessels, are these important to you? Oh, I'm sorry, I had no idea. You know, historians suggest that Belshazzar had served in the stand-in government that administered the land during Nebuchadnezzar's 7 years of madness. If that's the case, he absolutely had to know Daniel. He just didn't want to admit it, and he just didn't want to have to call on him. But God leaves him no alternative. You know, sometimes God, I feel, acts in a similar way today. Similar, not exactly the same. Here, God pushes Belshazzar to this point because he's going to act in judgment. In our day, sometimes I feel God acts in a similar way, not in judgment, but out of love and grace. Sometimes we see people who have lived their entire life thus far with no thought or regard for God, and suddenly circumstances enter their life, in critical, even catastrophic circumstances, and it leaves them no alternative but to turn to God. and in man's extremity is God's opportunity. Just before we move on to Daniel himself, however, just another thing that struck me. Do you notice what Belshazzar says in Daniel? It says to Daniel, in verse 14, again in verse number 16. He says in verse 14, I have heard of thee. He says in verse number 16, I have heard of thee. Now again, I suspect this is just him seeking to conceal his true knowledge of Daniel. However, if you just take him at face value, do you see what he's doing? As he talks to Daniel, all he's really doing is repeating the words of his mother. Now what he said was essentially correct, but it wasn't based on any knowledge, any learning, any understanding of his own. Just a simple application here. When it comes to the truth of God, the truth of Scripture, we don't want to be like that. And now don't get me wrong, it's better than nothing to be like that. Belshazzar calling Daniel was better than him not calling Daniel. And like Belshazzar, what we've heard and been told may well be entirely true and correct. But so much better to have studied for ourselves, examined and learnt for ourselves, applied the truths for ourselves, than just to have always heard them from somebody else, somewhere else, and only hold on to them second hand. Yes, of course, learn from others, absolutely. But then also go and examine it for yourself and make it your own. Don't let everything you hold simply be on the basis of what you've heard from other people, but rather what you have found out for yourself. Anyway, Daniel enters. And there are 4 characteristics of Daniel that just jumped out at me that I want us to see. And they are great characteristics to have as believers. Firstly, we see his righteousness. His righteousness. Daniel is not at the party. He's not there getting drunk with everybody else. He's not there cavorting with the wives and the concubines. He's not even with the other wise men. He's pursuing a separate, a holy, a righteous life. You know, just for us, dead simple application, righteousness really matters. In 1 Peter 1:15 we read this, as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation, all manner of life. Is that how I am living? Is that how you are living? Or are we trying to give the impression of living like that whilst also trying to quietly live as close to the world as we think we can get away with? Daniel, we see his righteousness. He kept himself separate from the sin of the city of Babylon. Secondly, we see his reputation, the way he is spoken about in verse number 11 and 12 and 14 and 16. Just to give a summary, it says, there's a man in thy kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him. An excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding and interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel. Even in a godless, sinful, idolatrous city like Babylon, Daniel stands out. Even the unbelievers of that empire have to recognize and acknowledge and respect the character of Daniel. What a fantastic reputation he has got. It's what we would often refer to not so much as our reputation, but as our testimony. How do the people around us view us? They may not agree with us, but how would they describe us? In 1 Timothy 3 verse 7 we read concerning the qualifications for an overseer. It says there, he must have a good report of them that are without. Now we might sit back and think to ourselves, well, that's okay because that's for the elders and I'm not one of those, so I'm all right, but we're not, because the next verse goes on to say this. It says, likewise must the deacons. Now who are the deacons? Well, the deacons are all those who serve, and so that should be every single one of us. And so we must have a good report of those that are without. Daniel absolutely did. We see his reputation. So we see his righteousness, we see his reputation, but then also we see his readiness. It is very evident just from the verses that we've thought about already that Belshazzar didn't make a habit of calling on Daniel. Daniel is very much sidelined within the kingdom. Apparently between the end of chapter number 4 and the start of chapter number 5, about 20 years elapse. You know, sometimes we forget the massive sort of time spans that occur in Scripture. What often takes us just a moment to read over takes decades in real life and in real time. We see Moses and he's in the basket floating on the Nile. Then he's killing the Egyptian and running away. Then he's returning to tell Pharaoh to let the people go. It's a few minutes of our reading. In real life, it's 80 years. Think about Joseph. He gets thrown into prison. He meets the butler and the baker. Then he's out and he's made prime minister. It's 5 minutes of reading for us. Yet actually his stay in prison was probably for 10 years or so. What's the lesson for us though? What's the lesson for us? Well, let's see what happened with Daniel. Despite the time that has passed while he's been pushed to the sidelines, when the moment comes, Daniel is ready. Despite the time that has passed in the palace and in the backside of the desert, when the moment comes, Moses is ready. Despite the time that's passed locked up in prison, when the moment comes, Joseph is ready. It's an attribute that I really, really envy. You know, so often, I tell Rach this sometimes, so often something happens and I want to respond in the best way. And I want to be able to press pause on the world. Something comes up that requires a response, and I want to, like when you get the TV remote and you press pause and it stops, it freezes. I want to be able to press pause and the whole world freezes at that moment. And it gives me the chance to go away and to think and to work out how I want to respond, and then come back, and then I can press play and I can do or say the thing that I want to do or say. But life's not like that, and it's impossible to press pause. And so often and so annoyingly, it's after the moment has passed that I think to myself, oh, I should have done that. Oh, I should have said this. You know, I need to work on being ready, just as Daniel was ready. How do we do that? How do we work on being ready? You know, I'm convinced the answer to that is found in day-to-day consistency. The Christian life is not all about constant drama and fireworks. It's about going on and faithfully and just following. Think about Daniel. By now he's in his 80s. Daniel's in his 80s by the time we come to these events. Up to this point in Daniel's 80 years of life, we have basically seen 4 days. Just 4 days. And Daniel only speaks on 3 of them. We saw him in chapter number 1 when he asked not to be given the king's food. That was 1 day, and he spoke there. We saw him in chapter number 1 again when we see him and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego being examined by the king and being found to be superior to the others. That's the 2nd day, and he didn't speak. We see him in chapter number 2 when he describes and then interprets the statue dream that Nebuchadnezzar has had. That's day number 3, and he speaks. And we see him in chapter number 4 when he interprets the tree dream that Nebuchadnezzar has. 4 days. That's all we've seen so far in the 80 years of Daniel's life. You know, so we often get so caught up with what we do for God, In many ways, I suspect so much more important than that is our day-to-day relationship with God. Daniel's here, he's 80 years old, and he is great, he is fantastic, he's one of the brilliant characters on the page of Scripture. But he's not great because of those 4 days that we've seen written about in the earlier chapters. Daniel's great because of the other 29,000 days that he has lived, where he just faithfully loved and obeyed and followed and prayed and so on and so forth. He's great because of those days where he consistently followed and trusted in and was faithful to his God. And so when day number 5 comes, this day where he's called upon again, well, he's ready. He's ready. And so we see his righteousness and we see his reputation and we see his readiness. And then fourthly, we see his reliability. None of the other wise men can interpret the writing on the wall. None of the other wise men can give the king an answer, but Daniel can. He's reliable. He's called upon to perform a function, to serve in a particular way, and he fulfills his role perfectly. He is reliable. What responsibilities has God given us, to me and to you? Daniel is teaching us, as we said a minute ago, that our relationship with God is the priority. But then also in those areas of service that we are responsible for, Daniel is teaching us to be reliable. Anyway, back to the account. Daniel's called, he walks in, he sees the writing on the wall, he reads it, he knows what it means. Belshazzar's there saying, what does it mean? What does it mean? All in a panic and so on and so forth. And he says, I'll give you this, I'll give you that. Just tell me what it means. Again, he's such a picture of the world, isn't he? He promises so much, but the benefits that he promises are at best very, very, very short-lived, and in reality they're essentially worthless. You know, he could make Daniel second in the, or third in the kingdom. Come tomorrow morning, there's not going to be a kingdom for Daniel to be third in. And so the benefits that he promises are at the very best short-lived and essentially worthless. And Daniel knows this because he's reading the writing on the wall. And in his mind he's thinking, you can offer me all these things, but by morning you're not going to be king. And so when the king makes his offers, he says to Belshazzar, he says, don't you worry about that. He says, you keep your reward, you can have this one for free. You know, I think it's a measure of the fallenness of Belshazzar. I think we see a measure of the fallenness of Belshazzar in the difference between how Daniel reacts to him and the way he reacts to Nebuchadnezzar. With the tree dream back in the last chapter, Daniel sees a 7-year period of judgment upon Nebuchadnezzar. And when he sees that, his response is very measured and very reticent. Daniel's even almost upset by what God has revealed to him. But here with Belshazzar, it's not 7 years of judgment, it's his death. It's the end of the empire. But Daniel's reaction is very different to what it is with Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel's reaction is very much okay, this is what it means. No shock, no being taken aback, no upset on Daniel's part. It's an indication of the nature of Belshazzar's reign. Maybe Daniel's pleased to see it coming to an end. And then Daniel starts to give the message. He starts by recapping how great Nebuchadnezzar was. In verse 18 he explains Nebuchadnezzar had sovereignty in an earthly kingdom sense and supremacy. Implication, you had just a second place, second rate stand-in for your dad. Nebuchadnezzar was so much greater than you, Belshazzar. In verse 19 he explains all people and nations trembled before Nebuchadnezzar. What's the implication? Belshazzar, you've got the Medes and Persians at your gate and rising up against you and winning. Nebuchadnezzar was so much greater than you. What's the point of the message? He says, he illustrates Nebuchadnezzar was so much greater than you, and yet God was infinitely greater than him. Infinitely greater than him. And yet this God, Belshazzar, is the one you've chosen to boast against. In verse 22 he says that, and mock. In verse 23 he says that, and disregard and replace. You know, so they were no doubt common sins in Babylon. Pride and blasphemy and idolatry and so on. They were the sins of the culture. But they were also the sins of the king. And God here through Daniel holds Belshazzar to account because Belshazzar knew better. Because he knew what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He'd seen it happen to Nebuchadnezzar, and yet he ignored the lessons that he should have learned. Well, Daniel turns to and he explains the writing on the wall. The writing on the wall, it says, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Numbered, weighed, divided. In layman's terms, what's the message of the writing on the wall? Essentially, Daniel says, Mene, God has got your number. Mene, and your number's up. Tekel, you don't measure up. Upharsin, your kingdom's going to be divided up. You know, here again we see God's sovereignty. As Daniel is speaking, there's a great army with brilliant tactics that's breaching Babylon's defences. But really, this is a kingdom that fell from within. Belshazzar's sin led to its downfall, but in actual fact, this is a kingdom that fell from above. God brought it down. And he just used the Medes and the Persians to work his purposes. You know, if we just think for a moment of that idea of assessment, of things being numbered, things being weighed, what does the equation say if God numbers or weighs our lives? We thought about it a few minutes ago, didn't we, about the chorus that says only one life will soon be past, only what's done for God will last. Are we storing up treasures on earth? Are we storing up treasure in heaven? Which side of that scale weighs heaviest for us? Are we piling on the wood and the hay and the stubble, or the gold and the silver and the precious stones? In terms of the scales of righteousness, you know, if we relied on our own righteousness, that scale is completely in deficit. All of our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. But of course we don't stand in our own righteousness. We stand in his righteousness, and he is utterly righteous. So on that scale we cannot be found wanting. but on the scales of relationship with him and manner of life and service that we render, and so on and so forth. That will be weighed, that will be measured, that will be assessed at the judgment seat of Christ. So my actions and attitudes today, my motives and my manner of life today, which way did I tilt the scales? Did I add a little bit of gold and silver and precious stones, or was it just more wood and hay and stubble that was being piled on you? Anyway, that's the interpretation and the explanation that is given. You know, in verse 29, just really as we come towards the end, verse 29, Belshazzar still gives Daniel all the rewards. He just doesn't get it. He's giving away third place in a kingdom that is in its dying hours, maybe its dying minutes. He's just been told about the demise of his kingdom, but it just doesn't sink in. You know, he reminds me of those people who come and sit in a gospel meeting after gospel meeting after gospel meeting, and there's no response. Maybe as they walk out the door, they just go, "Oh, lovely message," but there's no response. They hear truths that should shock them and shake them to the core, but it just doesn't seem to sink in. You know, I guess that just shows how the work of salvation and folks being reached with the gospel is a work of the Holy Spirit. Folks being saved is not down to how persuasively I can speak and my persuasive words. If I can talk somebody into something, you can be certain there's somebody out there who can talk them out of it. But when it comes to the Holy Spirit and his work, well, that's a different matter. But Belshazzar here, he blindly carries on. He gives Daniel his rewards. And that brings us on to the last two verses and the fulfillment of the prophecy. In that night, we read, in that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. You know, what's the key lesson from the chapter? The key lesson is that God is in control. God is in control. Belshazzar thought he was reigning supreme and in control, but no. He thought he could control his public image, and so he threw a party while the siege was going on to demonstrate his confidence and his lack of concern. But what happens? Everybody sees him trembling and terrified. He thought he was in control of all the knowledge and the information in the land. So when he wants to know something, he sends for all his wise men and his counselors, but not one of them can help him. He thought he was in control in Babylon, sitting pretty in a city that was deemed to be impregnable and capable of withstanding 70 years of siege. But even as he sits there, the Medes and the Persians, they're pouring in under the walls where the river used to flow. Ultimately, we see that God is in control, that God is sovereign. He's sovereign on the micro scale, overseeing the individual details of Daniel's life. He's sovereign on the macro scale, overseeing the empires and the rulers of the world. You know, that's the lesson of the chapter. It's the lesson of the book, really. It's the lesson of the Bible, the lesson of world history and all eternity. You know, saying for a very arrogant world, the writing is on the wall. The writing's on the wall. God is sovereign, and he will work out his will and his purpose. Our Anna has got a little picture just next door in her room. She got a little picture on her bedroom wall, and it's got just 4 words on it. The first 2 words on it, they say this. They say spoiler alert. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, a spoiler is when somebody gives away the plot to the end to a book or the end to a film or something, and it says spoiler alert. It warns you that it's going to tell you what's going to happen. And Anna's little picture, it just says spoiler alert. God wins. You know, I liked that. God absolutely wins. The future is not in any doubt, regardless of what might happen with coronavirus, regardless of what might happen as the fallout of Brexit carries on, regardless of what Mr. Putin or Kim Jong-un want to do, regardless of situations in the Middle East that are going on. God is in control. He is utterly sovereign on the micro and on the macro scale. He is working things out for his purposes. He's working things out for our good. God wins. Truth be told, he's already won. Just trust that God will bless these things from his word this evening. Thank you very much.